But the spiritual distance between me and alcohol grows the stronger my spiritual program is.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Peter O. Estevez Show. This is your host, Peter O. Estevez. Welcome. Today we have a very special episode. This is something that I have not done in a little while. It's something that not that I walked away from, but, as I often say in the podcast, I am whole and complete and I have a lot of topics to talk about. And although I started my journey in podcasting as a service to recovery, addiction, and mental health, at some point we transitioned the podcast into bringing together thought leaders from across the world and be able to address the issues that I am going across the world and in diverse communities. But, having said all of that, those issues, the addiction, the recovery, the mental health, they're issues that plague every community across the world. And they continue to affect people. And I do have a duty and responsibility to utilize my platform in a way that continues to serve those communities. And in observance or in observance of what it is, Dry January, month where many people that may or may not be in recovery, that may or may not have addiction issues, kind of take a pause in their drinking, kind of take they kind of slow down and they kind of gauge and see where they're at in their life. So because of that reason, I have an incredible guest today, Hailey Hosler, who has been in the restaurant and hospitality industry for the last 15 years or so. And the restaurant and hospitality industry is one of the top 3 industries in the world. It's one of the industries that hires, that employs the most number of population across the board. So, but there's also a subculture in that industry that suffers from a lot of issues, from addiction to recovery to mental health. And Hailey is somewhat of a spokesperson for one particular organization, and I'm going to let her get into that. And she talks deeply and passionately about the issues that are plaguing the community and the changes that are taking place, and how now the organization is actually Ben's Friends, and how there's now a new wave of mocktails or non-alcoholic drinks and other options available that have really risen since the pandemic in that industry. Hello, Hailey, and welcome to the Peter O. Estevez Show. Happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. It's good to see you again.
Likewise. You and I had a chat the other day, and we're both very passionate about this topic. But I want you to tell us from your perspective, why are you so passionate about it? What is going on in the industry, and what is Ben's Friends doing about it?
Sure. I loved what you just said about being in service to recovery. And I feel like the 2 places that I am in service are recovery and the restaurant industry. Those are the 2 things that have given me the most in this life. They've done so much for me. That's my closest friends, my family members, everything. And so I consider myself to be completely in service to those 2 things. And Ben's Friends is a beautiful cross section of the 2, where we get to explore, staying in the industry that we love so much while taking care of ourselves, which used to be at complete odds to be in the restaurant industry and to take care of yourself. And I'd like to be a part of changing that.
Well, let's talk about that. Why was it at odds? And what do you mean when you say it used to be at complete odds to be in the restaurant industry and to take care of yourself? I've always found that industry to be somewhat of a bohemian, artistic, kind of a unique culture. I lived, you and I shared that I lived downtown San Antonio. I lived in the San Antonio River, which is a kind of a touristy attraction. And I lived for many years. And back in my drinking days, I was a bar rat. I was one of those guys that stayed after hours. I was the after hour guys, and I had the after hours party. And I always found that there was a lot of promiscuity.
Yeah.
A lot of addiction, a lot of mental health issues. But yet there was a lot of incredible talent in that community. But tell us what you mean by that being at odds.
Sure. Well, I can share a little bit of my story, which is just, I think addiction would have found me wherever I was, but the restaurant industry is a fabulous place to hide an addiction. It's pretty normalized. It's showing up for work hungover and using drugs to get through a shift. That I think that's more normalized in the food and beverage industry than it is anywhere else. And I think it would have been noticed a lot quicker had I been in any other industry. But I also think that the way society treats the food and beverage industry is the addiction and the mental health crisis is a direct response to that. So when we have leadership describing restaurant workers as low skilled, or people are showing up to restaurants and not respecting the workers, being downright rude and still expecting, this wonderful experience at a restaurant. Of course, the middle finger is kind of going to go up to society, and you're going to create this subculture of people who just wants to sort of party and let loose. And I think the amount of times that I have heard quoted in this restaurant recovery group that I'm now in, the idolizing of Anthony Bourdain and that very punk rock kitchen culture, which is, of course, it's very cool. We all love it. But the part that most people don't talk about is that Anthony Bourdain is a wonderful example of a man who had a lot of demons, and his death undeniably is attached to his addiction problems. And so I think the fact that we're not talking about that side of the punk rock party restaurant culture is a big part of it, and we need to be talking about it.
And I completely agree with you. Much like the hair industry and a lot of many industries that are, cool, artistic, there's a lot of incredibly skilled, talented people that use the restaurant or the food and beverage industry or the restaurant industry as a transition to their career. There's actors, there's actresses, there's singers, there's artists, there's all kinds of people. So that's kind of a gateway to a career path, but it's also a major gateway entry into a deep, lost, dark cloud of addiction. Okay. Yeah. Now, tell me what exactly is Ben's Friends doing in that regards, and what are you doing? What is your role as that?
Sure. So Ben's Friends has multiple chapters across many cities. There's one in Austin, in your backyard, run by a wonderful chef named Philip Spear. I think there are 12 to 15 chapters at this point in multiple cities. And then there's a national meeting that happens every single day on Zoom at 10 a.m. We also have nighttime meetings as well as a men's and a women's meeting. But the local city chapters, they meet in person and they function sort of, they might, if you've been to a 12-step meeting, they might look sort of familiar in that, we sit in a circle and we share, but they're oriented around the restaurant industry. And unlike 12-step recovery, they're not anonymous. So we share our stories. This is one of the things that I loved when I first talked to you, is that you said, the rooms of AA, stories go to die. Right. And that's simply not true. At Ben's Friends, we share our stories very openly and we're open to sharing them publicly. And the amazing thing about that is that that's how I got sober, was I saw a public story. I wouldn't have known that it was possible. And I certainly wouldn't have known that it was possible to stay in this industry that I love so much and be sober if people hadn't shared their stories publicly.
Absolutely. And I'm a firm believer, and I use Malala's quote that I don't share my story because it's unique. I share my story because it's a story of many. And the moment I share my story, I allow others the permission to share theirs.
It's true.
By default, people begin to identify. I think there's a big difference between sharing your story, and it's something that I have learned to craft over the years. How do we share our story? How do we share it in a way that is of service and that it does not become a sobbing story? Okay. Yeah. Because we unfortunately or fortunately, we live in a society where we want everything to be pretty and crispy and nice, right? Yeah. And if we learn to share our story in service, and we learn to story tell instead of telling our story, we are able to captivate the audience, and we're able to bring them into and identify with each part of our lives. And the reality is, I want to touch a little bit more on what you said about the 12-step program. As you well know, because we spoke about it, and many of my listeners know about this, I'm very open about my recovery. I've been sober 22 years. I got sober in a room of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was one of those guys that I used to think, and I still believe to this day, why is that it was okay for me to be a publicly open drunk, but it's not okay for me to be a publicly open man in recovery and in sobriety? That just did not make sense to me. Okay. So everybody knew I was a drunk, but nobody can know that I'm in recovery. Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is a matter of choice, right? But so I appreciate the fact that Ben's friend does that there's an open format to share your stories and it's not anonymous, because the reality is that if we look at the Me Too movements, Martin Luther King movements, and any movements, those movements would have not taken place and moved forward and achieve and accomplish the things that they have accomplished if they wait to remain anonymous.
Yeah, exactly. We have to hold the microphone to
Yes,
have
absolutely. And the reality is that the only way to be able to address an issue and to address a problem is to bring it to the forefront, to speak about it, okay, to talk about it. You know, unfortunately, I do believe that we are coming out of a generation or multiple generations of secrecy, okay, hypocrisy, keeping the things in the closet. And I think that the younger generations are beginning to question why do we do this? And it's not anymore the answer because I told you say so, we don't accept that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we want to know the why and the how and how do we fix it. And I love that. Now let me ask you a question. You said that this particular Ben's Friends is more it's an open format. It's not anonymous. There's several chapters across the U.S. One in Austin, my new hometown.
Yes.
But it's more geared to the food and beverage or the restaurant industry.
It is, yes.
It is. Is it open to general public or is it a specific?
You know, since I've been more public about my sobriety, I do get a lot of people asking, can I join Ben's Friends if I'm not in the food and beverage industry? And the answer is yes. It is an alternative to 12-step meetings, and it is geared towards people in the hospitality industry. And we do focus on some very tangible, specific concerns that might come up for someone trying to stay sober in the industry. For example, you know, pouring alcohol for an event or working with really good wine. And so we talk about concrete ways of actually staying sober in that environment. So that's part of it. But then we also talk about much broader topics like spirituality and gratitude and community service and giving back and things that are just really great to hear no matter who you are.
Let's talk about that. Spirituality.
Okay, let's go. We're going big.
Gratitude and community service. Okay. Let's talk about each one of those and talk to me about the importance of those three particular rituals, practices, beliefs, if you mind. And what are the importance of those in anyone's sobriety, but more importantly, in anybody's life, because you just touched a chord that is very dear to my heart.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So I actually coined the term spiritual distancing, which I think is a very key term for us or a key concept for us in the food and beverage industry. And that is, there's this idea that like you know, they say you shouldn't go to a barbershop because you're eventually going to get a haircut. That's an old AA saying, right? Which means you shouldn't hang out in an environment where there are drugs and alcohol because you will eventually do that. I get that to some extent, especially in early sobriety, that it might not be the healthiest to be hanging out in bars all the time. However, I love bars and restaurants, and that will never change. And because I have a very spiritual foundation, and when I take care of my spirituality and my spiritual connection, I can go wherever I want. And you can have drugs in your pocket right next to me, and I don't want them because I have a spiritual distance between me and those drugs. And it's different than physical distance, which again is sometimes important, especially in the beginning. But the spiritual distance between me and alcohol grows the stronger my spiritual program is.
I love it. And I love the term spiritual distancing. Okay. I love that. And I coined the phrase, the 5 pillars. Okay. And the 5 pillars, basically they rise to tending to the physical, the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, and the financial. What I discover, and primarily this belief system, this teaching, came out of a book that I wrote and is to be published and released this 2022. One of my events that I'm hosting for the first ever leadership and personal development global summit that we're hosting in Las Vegas, Nevada. Okay, but what I realized was that at some point, the program of recovery, the 12-step program, and the Rules of Alcoholics Anonymous were supporting my codependency, and they were stunting my growth. Okay. There were certain issues we would go in there to talk about the problem. Okay. Although they say we talk about the solution they only found it in the book. Okay. In the big book. Okay. The book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay. Yeah. Which was the original, the original version was published, back in 1935. Okay. And of course, there's been updated versions ever since, or editions ever since. However, the reality is that is rooted in a culture, much like a subculture in the restaurant industry, that had a certain belief system that, just like our educational system, our government system, our religious system, they're outdated. Okay, they're outdated. The world has progressed. The world has changed. We have evolved as human beings. Our brains have expanded. Okay, I don't believe that we operate from five senses. I believe that we are multi-sensory individuals. Okay, you take that in, and you take intuition as part of a sense. You take gut feeling as part of a sense. You think a connection to spirituality is part of a sense. So we have become multi-sensory individuals that do not need to operate from a conscious subconscious. We can operate from a single state of consciousness. Okay. So I believe that a lot of those systems, a lot of those beliefs have been outdated, and they do not allow us as individuals to grow and move forward. We still applying a belief system that was established back in 1935. Okay. Yeah. So what I discovered when I went back into, I was what you call a dry drunk for almost 8 years, right? Okay. A term that was coined by Alcoholics Anonymous.
We all know him, though.
Yeah, but we know him well, right? The reality is that there is somebody that is not tending to their 5 pillars: the physical, the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, the financial. And what I also realized in those rooms was that there was a lot of people sober, but they were broke and miserable.
Yeah, that is real. Yeah, I'll give you that for sure.
And I didn't want to be broke, and I didn't want to be miserable, and I didn't want to be out of shape, and I didn't want to be drinking coffee and chain smoking all the time. Yeah. Okay, that was just not for me. Yeah. I wanted to be in good physical shape. I wanted to feel happy. I wanted to be able to find the high that I searched for in alcohol. Okay, because the reality is that not every drunk that I had was a bad drunk. I had a lot of fun. Yeah. Okay. And I told my mentor, my sponsor, whatever you want to call him or her, I want to be high on life. I was looking to change the way I felt. Okay. And being sober has not changed the way I felt. Okay. Yeah. I still feel sad. I still feel depressed. I still feel not enough. I still feel like an imposter. I still feel like this, like this, like this. How do I change? And what I discovered is that I was not going to find that in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was not going to find that in the 12-step program. I had to find that in myself.
Yeah.
Okay. So now tell me, besides the meetings, besides the open space, besides the lack of not being anonymous, what else is that the Ben's Friends offers people wanting to stay sober, wanting to stay clean?
Well, the community support is pretty incredible. And I've actually found I found the community support to be the strongest community I've ever been a part of, for sure. And that is, if someone shows up to a meeting and they say, I have this shift tonight I'm really nervous about. I'm in early sobriety. I'm worried I'm going to drink. They have 7 phone numbers immediately. And those 7 people are calling throughout that shift and texting and making sure. And they set up an accountability practice of, at the end of the shift, you call us and you make sure that you didn't drink. And that level of support, especially from people who have been through it themselves, is amazing for early sobriety. It's such a gift, right? And Alcoholics Anonymous does that as well, but Ben's Friends is so specific. Like, I have done that shift. I have been there. I have felt what it's like to pour wine when I'm only 1 month sober, and here's how I got through it. And I'm here to help. So,
and I want to talk a little bit about that again, because you also mentioned that the spiritual distancing, right? How do we separate ourselves? How do we avoid not getting a haircut if we keep sitting on the barber's seat, right? Yeah. Tell me some of the things that you do. Let's talk. No, first, let's dive in a little bit. Tell me about your journey. Tell me about your because I think it's important, when we go about storytelling, I think it's important that people know, people are going to look at you. You're a pretty woman, you're well-dressed, well-groomed, you're pretty glasses, you're pretty shirt. So they're going to say, well, not her, right?
Yeah.
You're not the typical stereotype that we would say.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your journey. Let's talk about how you started and what happened and what was your bottom, as we call it in AA.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for those compliments. And I will say that I experienced myself to have an incredibly privileged recovery journey, in that I had a lot of family support, and that I was taken care of in a way. And that's a huge part of why I hold so much weight in giving back and being in service, is because I know that my journey looks so different from others. And I know that, like, I went to a wonderful treatment center, but right down the road, there were a lot of people in jail doing time for the same drugs that I was doing.
Yeah.
So that being said, I grew up in the restaurant industry. I've been in it forever. My parents had a food cart that they brought to music festivals, and my sister and I were sort of the main employees. And I started exploring drugs and alcohol as a very young teenager. And I started working in fine dining just after that. My grandmother comes from a family of 14 children, a large Irish Catholic family. And one of the aunts has a wonderful French restaurant in Northern California. And there's like 76 of us, first and second cousins. So everyone takes a turn and goes and works at this restaurant. And that's when I really fell in love with restaurant family and the camaraderie and, putting on the show. And then I worked in restaurants for a really long time after that. And I actually moved to the Dominican Republic to open restaurant concepts. And my drinking really ramped up there. And I experienced my first sort of set of consequences. I gained a lot of weight and I felt really unhealthy. And I also had a really difficult time doing my job, even though I cared about it a lot. And I had this interesting thing where I had that experience, and then I came home and I didn't have a program or anything, but I stopped drinking and I went back to the Dominican and opened a new restaurant. And it was a totally different experience, right? I was doing yoga every day. I had that spirituality. I had a totally different community and friends that I was hanging out with. And so I got this contrast of a life where I was taking care of myself versus a life where I wasn't, in the same beach town. And that was the first time that I think I thought, okay, maybe, this is the way for me. Came back to Oregon, worked at restaurants again, ended up opening my own craft cocktail catering business that quickly turned into a cocktail design firm in San Francisco. And I went through a painful breakup during that time. I felt really lost and confused in San Francisco. I didn't quite know who I was. And my drug use was out of control all of a sudden. And I was a daily cocaine user and pretty much daily drinker as well. And I was never like cool about it. Like, I had emotional meltdowns the whole time. I had friends who could do drugs and drink and hang out, and they seemed like they were just fine and cool all the time. And I would do the same amount and have these epic, hysterical, suicidal meltdowns. And that went on for a full year until finally I surrendered, as they say. And when I say I had a very privileged experience, I had an aunt and uncle who stepped in and supported me going to treatment and helped me just sort of take care of everything so that I could do it. And I had to put my business on hold and then eventually sell my business. And a lot of people rallied around me to help me take care of myself. And a lot of people showed me what I could not see in myself at the time, which was that I had a bright future ahead of me if I took care of myself.
Wow. What an incredible story. And there's several things that you said about the story that are really touching, but one of the things that you said right now, and I think it's key, that a lot of people surrounded you and love you when you couldn't love yourself. Okay? Yeah. And the reality is that the old traditional way of the old belief system, okay, in recovery and addiction and mental health is tough love, right?
Yeah.
Let them hit bottom, okay? Which, in my opinion, how can you humanly see a person in pain that is out of their own being? When we are in the throes of addiction, we're out of our being, we're out of ourselves, we're out of our minds, we really have no clear judgment or clarity of what the world is like. Okay. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
truly don't believe that tough love is a solution to that. Okay.
I'm with you. I'm with you, Peter. And I used to say that it was women who needed the softness and men sort of needed that tough love. And the longer I've been in recovery, men need it so bad. They need
just as
love.
much, just as much,
They
just as
do.
much.
They need love
Yeah.
from others, and they need to love themselves. And I hate it when I'm in a recovery room and I hear, I'm a drunk asshole who doesn't know shit. You know, I don't
Yeah.
abide by that. I don't like to hear that. I don't agree with that.
And I also want to talk to you about a couple of things, because I think it's important. Not that you've been through a journey, and not that you have experienced something. You know, the restaurant industry, the drinks, the alcohol. I mean, it's called a spirit for a reason, right? It gives us a lift. It gives us a high. It gives us a joy. It's something that we're not going to avoid in society, period.
Yeah.
It's mainstream and is there to stay, right? But there's also the factor that all those sobriety and recovery and mental health issues have become more mainstream, and we talk about them more, and we're open and we are addressing them. Then we still have the celebrity factor, right? We have Carl Racky from Summer House, who was a guest on my podcast, and he publicly had, you know, an alcohol issue, right? And he got sober on the series and had a couple of relapses. Then we have DJ Kennedy from Vanderpump Rules, that off and sober and not sober and default. We have this other girl that I love, the blonde one, Kenna from Vanderpump Rules also. They got married. So now that you don't, I talk about that for a reason. We cannot avoid that. We cannot avoid social media. We cannot avoid seeing the glamour, the sexy life and all of that. Now that you've been through their journey, for that young 15-year-old Hailey, what would you tell her, or what would you have done different to seek out for help?
That is such a good question. And I will say, we were talking about finding your motivation in sharing your story. And that, of course, sometimes, you know, it's ego driven, or I want to be on stage or whatever. But when I think about the ultimate motivation, it's what does that girl need to hear? Gosh, all that's coming to me is just that you are worthy of taking care of yourself. That's like the strongest message that's coming forward to me right now. But that you can exist in this world that you love, of food and drinks and connection and community, and take care of yourself. And they're not mutually exclusive. That's
I love life. And the reality is that nobody wants to be a hermit. Nobody wants to run away.
They absolutely don't. Yeah. And I love this industry. I truly do. I'll tell you, the first time a light sort of went off for me on this topic, I had a sponsor. My first sponsor said, you cannot be in the restaurant industry. That's my rule. You cannot be in the restaurant industry. That's a hard rule for me with my sponsees. And up until that point, I had been, you know, fully on board, and I'll do whatever you tell me because I'm so desperate and lost that I just need guidance. And she said that, and it hurt. First of all, I was like, ouch, I don't, you know, this is the thing that I love. It's my lifeblood. But then she shared her story, and she shared that she had been in the medical industry, still was. She was now a doctor, and she had had all these relapses tied to the medical industry, right? So she had pills at work and addiction issues, and she didn't have to leave her industry that she'd worked so hard to build a career for herself in. So that's sort of when the light went off for me, and I thought, there's got to be more, and there's got to be more people like me that love this industry so dearly and want to stay in it and want to be a part of the positive change in it, because it's a huge movement, not just with addiction, but things are changing rapidly in the restaurant industry. And then I found Ben's Friends, and it's true. It's hundreds of people that feel the same way.
And let's talk about the changes in the restaurant industry, like many other industries, as a result of COVID. Okay. Yeah. As a result of all the food delivery platforms, that industry as a whole is beginning to shrink, right? More particularly in the front line, right? On the server side. Okay. So tell us a little about about the experiences and how that industry is revolutionizing. How is it changing? How is it adapting? How is it pivoting?
Yeah. So in spending time in these meetings and hearing, I get to hear a lot about what people want that are in the restaurant industry. And I think that the number one thing is like, we want health insurance. That's like the biggest thing that we hear all the time. And, But I think that I would categorize that in resources. So it's resources and respect. And those are the two things that people often don't get. But there are certain restaurants that provide those things for their employees. And in turn, I think clientele provides the same. And those are the restaurants that I think are really going to make it. COVID has been incredibly hard on the restaurant industry, and it was not very well taken care of by legislation, or, there were a lot of support that came too little too late during COVID. And a lot of people just left the restaurant industry because they weren't being supported. So I think resources and respect are huge. I now have a position that has benefits, health insurance, HR. If there's a problem, I get to go to my HR that explains my benefits to me and helps me, with my financial literacy. That's all part of but most jobs in most industries, but the restaurant industry, that does not exist. Financial literacy, try, here's $250 in ones. Good luck. I will never forget, I went to a workshop on financial literacy for bartenders, and it was a sea of people just furiously taking notes. Like, this was our one time to hear about this. Other than that, we were left pretty high and dry in the industry. And as like taking care of your health in any facet, health insurance is major. That's a major, major resource that's very important. And I had help going to treatment, but I wouldn't have been able to do it having been in the restaurant industry because I didn't have health insurance.
Wow. I personally, I travel a lot, so I've experienced a lot of changes. Very early on, I never forget, I was somewhere in Southern California, right in the midst of COVID, and my buddy and I went to a marina, and we had lunch at the marina, and the hostess escorted us to the table. They gave us a keypad. Okay, we order everything from the keypad. Okay, and including we pre-inserted our credit card on it. Okay, the server brought us our food, and at the end of us, at the end, we just closed out the pad. And I could see incredible amount of benefits for the industry, for the business itself, right? You shrink your personnel. There's a lot of quality control on your food costs. You know what's going in and what's going out, right? Mm-hmm. But I also noticed something that keeps popping up, even if I go to Starbucks, and a lot of businesses that are not full service, they're counter service. Yeah. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that have the same question that I do. And it's something that pops up now, the option to tip. Why?
Are you asking me if you should tip? Because absolutely.
No, but my question is, why is that option more prevalent? Is it because of the conditions? Is that money actually going back into support the work staff, or is it a new revenue line for the business?
It shouldn't be. It should not be a revenue line for the business. Yeah. So I recently was traveling in Europe. I spent time in Spain and Portugal, and I did a little bit of interviewing about this because it's pretty well known that in Europe, tipping is a totally different thing. It's not expected. It's
right.
Often it's not even an option to tip in Europe. At this point in this country, you still have to tip. I shouldn't tell you what to do.
And I do it. It's just a question. I just see it come up in odd places.
The tipping at this point is still a supplement to a living wage and to a lack of benefits in an industry. And so it's very helpful and supportive for restaurant workers to be tipped. Yeah. Wow. And until that changes, I hope that changes. I hope that we have structure in place, that people are better taken care of. And maybe in that time, tips will be a thing of the past. But at this point, we're still relying heavily on them.
Okay. Yeah. Hailey, how can we support you? How can our community support you? How can our community support Ben's friend? What can we do to be of service to you and and the group that you so dearly represent?
I'm so grateful for this platform just to talk about it. If anyone out there is listening that is a bartender, chef, restaurant owner, dishwasher, any role in a restaurant and is struggling, my door is open to you. I'm all about sharing resources, and Ben's Friends is an incredible one. It's free, by the way. The groups are totally free to attend, and You can check out your local chapter. Go to the Austin and introduce yourself.
Absolutely, I'm going to do it. I'm a very curious person,
Yeah.
so I'm definitely going to do it, and I'm going to attend the meeting, and I will report back to the audience what my feedback is at.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Hailey Hosler, thank you so much. All
Peter.
your social media handles and contact information will be available in the show note. Please make sure and follow this young lady, and let's support best friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Likewise.